The B-21 Raider, touted as the world's most technologically advanced strategic bomber, is expected to conduct globe-spanning missions that could take upwards of 40 hours or more from start to finish. And yet, according to a recent memo out of the Air Force's Global Strike Command, the B-21 may be the first American heavy payload bomber in history to fly these kinds of marathon missions with just a single pilot on board, reserving that second seat in the cockpit for a weapons systems officer, or WISO, instead. Now, today's B-52s and B-1B Lancer bombers operate with a pair of pilots and a pair of weapons systems officers on board. Even the advanced B-2 Spirit, the B-21's direct stealth predecessor, flies with two highly trained pilots, using automation and thorough planning to distribute mission responsibilities. But now, the B-21 is expected to conduct these same sorts of extended duration bombing missions with just one pilot at the stick and a WISO trained in flight ops just in case of emergencies. And while the crew requirements of bombers might not seem like the sexiest topic of discussion when it comes to the most advanced stealth jet in the sky, this revelation actually points to what all evidence suggests may be among the most groundbreaking changes to combat flight operations since the introduction of GPS. A bomber with such advanced onboard autonomy that the role of the pilot is shifting away from actually flying the plane and towards supervising their AI co-pilot instead. And that could just be the beginning. So let's talk about the changing makeup of bomber crews and why the B-21 dropping a pilot is such a big deal. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. A Beijing-based professor recently claimed that China's next nuclear-powered aircraft carrier could be armed with directed energy weapons and even railguns. And for some reason, Western news outlets have been reporting on those claims as though they came from the Chinese Navy itself, or even as though this aircraft carrier already exists. And you guys guessed it, I've been staying on top of this story thanks to Ground News. Ground News is an aggregator that collects articles published by news outlets all over the world and places them all into a single easy-to-read feed that helps me not just stay on top of what's going on, but also to see right through these common forms of modern media bias. Right here on Ground News, I can see that 21 news outlets have already covered this story, including just one left-leaning and just 4 right-leaning ones. Headlines related to this story really run the gamut of credibility, with some very respectably reporting on the delivery of China's third non-nuclear carrier, like this one, that reads, "China delivers warning to US and Japan with third aircraft carrier." But others are borderline silly, like this one that reads, "The US stunned by China's leap. China's revolutionary nuclear-powered aircraft carrier redefine naval supremacy with futuristic technology." And Ground News also shows you vital information about each outlet along with those headlines, like their political bias, their factuality rating, corporate ownership, or government affiliations. And I really appreciate the Ground News blind spot feature that shows me stories that are getting lots of attention in one political sphere, but not in the other. It helps me keep my media intake balanced. Ground News is a big part of my research and my day-to-day news consumption, and it can be for you too. Just go to ground.news/sandboxx with 2 X's, or follow that link in the description below to get 40% off the same Vantage plan that I use every day. Again, that's ground.news/sandboxx to get 40% off of their Vantage plan that'll help you stay on top of things. Flying complex bombing missions has long been among the most challenging jobs America has assigned to its airmen. Tasked with flying hundreds, or as time pressed on, thousands of miles into unfamiliar and hostile territory, long before the introduction of GPS, carrying some of the most advanced and often finicky technology of their time, and striking targets with what we now consider to be dumb bombs, or unguided munitions, through complex targeting systems that required incredible expertise and sometimes a bit of luck to impact anywhere near your assigned target. When the revolutionary B-29 Superfortress entered service all the way back in 1944, it carried 11 crew members in its first-of-its-kind pressurized crew compartments, distributing the immense workload of operating its onboard system among a pilot, a co-pilot, a bombardier, a flight engineer, a navigator, a radio operator, a radar observer, and 4 gunners. 4 years later, the mammoth B-36 Peacemaker emerged, capable of carrying more than 15 times the payload of the B-29 and requiring an even bigger crew thanks to newly emerging electronic warfare capabilities. B-36s could operate with crews as small as 13, but more often than not carried 15 on board, including a pilot, a co-pilot, 2 navigators, a bombardier, a flight engineer, 2 radio operators, 2 electronic countermeasure operators, and 5 gunners for defense. But then things began to change. As the technology stuffed into the massive fuselages of these bombers matured alongside aircraft design practices and shifting air warfare tactics, it became more feasible to streamline the tasks assigned to crew members. In 1955, the now legendary B-52 Stratofortress entered service, and despite carrying a similar maximum payload under normal operations to the mighty B-36 that entered service just 7 years earlier, it required a crew complement of just 6. Made up of a pilot, a co-pilot, a navigator, a radar operator and bombardier, an electronic warfare officer, and a single tail gunner that was later gotten rid of. In a lot of ways, the B-52 represented a pivotal moment in bomber history as American air power shifted away from the turboprop titans of World War II and plunged headlong into the jet and eventually the digital ages. By 1986, this transition allowed for heavy payload bombers like the B-1B Lancer to also carry 15 times the payload of a B-29, but at supersonic speeds, while leveraging variable geometry wings to provide nearly fighter-like aerobatic performance along the way. And despite this incredible leap in capability, the B-1B required an even smaller crew, with just a pilot, a co-pilot, an offensive systems officer, and a defensive systems officer filling its crew compartment. And then in 1997, the B-2 Spirit changed everything about long-range bomber operations all over again, bringing low observability to bear against enemy air defenses in a sleek flying wing bomber design that could carry more than 60,000 pounds of ordnance under cover of stealth. This technological camouflage not only allowed for a steep reduction in crew requirements, but also in support aircraft as well, with Spirits flying alone and unafraid, deep behind enemy lines for upwards of 44 hours at a time, while piloted by just a crew of 2, a pilot in the left seat and a mission commander, also a rated pilot, in the right. The B-2's range of better than 6,900 miles, combined with its mid-flight refueling capabilities, means the aircraft is, to some extent, more constrained by the limitations of human endurance than anything else. In fact, during operations over Afghanistan, one B-2 crew flew a 44-hour and 20-minute bombing mission before landing in Diego Garcia, where they left the engines running and climbed out of the aircraft. Over the course of just 45 minutes, the bomber was refueled, oil was added to the engines, the chemical toilet was emptied, new food was brought on board, and another crew took off, heading back to the U.S. A half dozen B-2s did the same in all, keeping their engines burning for more than 70 straight hours before getting back to Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. Now, many of the roles previously divvied up among flight engineers, navigators, bombardiers, and more have been streamlined and automated into little more than auxiliary duties for the two pilots, who meticulously schedule their missions to ensure both are awake and alert when necessary, while also allowing for chances to get some rest in the meantime. In particular, both pilots need to be awake and in their seats, not just for the weapons engagement portion of the flight, but also for each and every complex and risky mid-flight refueling, which, depending on payload, may be as frequent as just every few hours. I'll quote Lieutenant Colonel Nikki Rogue Polidor, a B-2 pilot and the 509th Bomber Wing's Chief of Safety, from an interview she did with Defense News back in 2019. Quote, "When you're faced with a 24-hour mission or a long-duration mission, you really get into the details of who's going to do what task and how we're going to manage our sleep. The timing of every task needs to be set in advance so that we're both prepared to be in the seat, ready to go for all the air-to-air refueling and the weapons activity, and then, of course, landing." In a way, you can think of these long-duration bombing runs sort of like a road trip in your family sedan, except you can't make any stops at gas stations and you need to refuel from a moving gas truck. And instead of seeing grandma at the halfway point, you gotta deploy a few dozen tons of high explosives to very precise coordinates. But otherwise, just like a road trip. You only need one driver for the stretches between those dangerous refueling operations with a moving gas truck, so you can take turns napping during those stretches, because you both need to be alert and on your game by the time you get to grandma's house, before, turning back to make the return trip. But just because there's time to nap doesn't necessarily mean anybody actually gets to. Because of the duration of these missions, target coordinates often change after the bomber has already departed, which not only means needing to feed new coordinates into targeting computers and each individual precision-guided weapon, but it often requires changing or planning entirely new routes to those target sets. Stealth is not a cloak of invisibility and should really be thought of as a combination of design traits and material sciences, and especially combat tactics, all meant to mask your aircraft's signatures from detection. Now, this means poring over intelligence regarding the position and known capabilities of enemy air defense assets, and then planning routes into and out of the target zone that present the aircraft at the optimal angle of observation and distance in order to stay hidden. Then, as the bomber actually approaches its intended target, its advanced radar, an upgraded low probability of intercept active electronically scanned array produced by Raytheon called the AN/APQ-181, digitally maps the terrain below and creates a precise 3D model of the target area that allows for even more precision than is usually provided by military intelligence. Intel might be able to tell you the coordinates of an intended target, but the B-2's radar allows pilots to drop munitions through doorways or ventilation shafts. This time, I'll quote retired Air Force Colonel Mel Dial, who flew a record-setting 44.3-hour B-2 bombing run back in October of 2001, from an interview that he did with Air and Space Forces magazine just this year. Quote, "You're reviewing target folders, reviewing timing, checking our fuel consumption so that we don't run out of gas over the Pacific." If a pilot does get the chance to rest, the accommodations in the B-2 are pretty sparse. Despite its huge 172-foot wingspan, the B-2's rest area consists of little more than a modified army cot and a chemical toilet that pilots are quick to point out does not have the capacity for 40-plus hours worth of waste. As a result, pilots primarily use piddle packs, or small plastic bags filled with a kitty litter-like substance that turns fluids into a less leak-prone gel. Staying hydrated is incredibly important for maintaining high levels of mission performance, and as DL recalled from his 44.3-hour flight, they ended up offloading about 100 pounds of pea-infused waste gel when they finally made their landing in Diego Garcia. Obviously, in these conditions, it isn't uncommon for sleep to be intermittent or impossible for pretty long stretches of the flight, so pilots have even been known to be issued go pills, which are pretty heavily regulated amphetamines by flight surgeons to help keep them awake when they need to be. In other words, with such a significant pilot workload, it's hard to imagine a world where these kinds of globe-spanning bomber runs could be done with anything less than at least 2 pilots on board. But then, in a way, the B-21 may indeed have 2 bomber drivers in the cockpit, one that's made out of meat, and another comprised entirely out of ones and zeros. This time, I'll quote a recent memo from General Thomas Bussiere, the commander of Air Force Global Strike Command. Quote, "Unleashing the Raider's full potential demands a complex blend of skills: airmanship, weaponeering, electromagnetic spectrum operations, sensor management, real-time battle management, and agile replanning in combat. For this reason, the B-21 will be crewed by 1 pilot and 1 weapons systems officer." Now, it is important that we clarify that this memo represents Global Strike Command's recommendation, and it isn't official quite yet, but based on trends in the Air Force's drone fighter efforts, known as the Collaborative Combat Aircraft Program, it's pretty easy to see how this tide began to turn. A great deal of emphasis has been placed in recent years on the AI agents, as they're known, that are currently being trained in the cockpits of very real fighter jets, like the Air Force Research Lab's heavily modified F-16D, known as the X-62 Vista. These dogfighting automatons have already demonstrated what former Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall described as near parity with seasoned human fighter pilots in simulated air combat exercises conducted in real jets with fake weapons. And in the not-too-distant future, they'll be tasked with piloting purpose-built drone fighters, like the General Atomics YFQ-42 and Anduril's YFQ-44, both of which are already in pre-production flight testing. But for all the fanfare these AI-piloted fighter drones are rightfully getting, this work has progressed with a parallel and arguably equally important effort to change the way crewed aircraft operate too. Next-generation fighters, like Boeing's F-47, are being designed from the ground up to fly at the center of a constellation of drone wingmen, ranging in cost and capability from single-use systems that sort of blur the lines between drones and missiles, like Lockheed Martin's Common Multi-Mission Trucks, or Comets, all the way up to fully-fledged and pilotless vertical-landing multi-role stealth fighters like Shield AI's new X-Bat. And this wide variety of pilotless assets, each offering different combat capabilities and thresholds for acceptable risk, means the pilots at the heart of these formations will really have their work cut out for them. Not only flying their own few $100 million worth of state secrets through fiercely contested territory, but providing command instructions to anywhere from 2 to maybe as many as dozens of drones throughout the battle space. Now, this promises to place a huge cognitive load on fighter pilots who were already arguably overtasked in the heat of the fight. So, in order to combat this information and sensory overload, the Air Force has taken a 2-track approach to new system development. The first is finding the right way to manage drone assets, which means finding the right pilot-drone interface. And current evidence is pointing toward using a tablet mounted on the cockpit or on a kneeboard, but other control methods, like giving simple voice commands, are also being experimented with. And then, giving the drones themselves the edge computing capabilities that they need to turn simple commands into complex actions without needing to be micromanaged by the human pilot. And just to clarify here, edge computing just means having the necessary processing power on board the drone itself to operate effectively with intermittent or interrupted communications with the fighter that they're taking their cues from. But the second, lesser discussed approach to reducing the cognitive burden placed on pilots is all about installing an advanced AI co-pilot directly into the cockpit with them, effectively allowing artificial intelligence to handle the more mundane aspects of flying while the pilot serves as more of a battle manager than a traditional stick jockey. If you're familiar with the long-standing tradition of comparing the data-fusing F-35 to a quarterback in the sky, with its pilots leveraging sensor-packed situational awareness to direct other piloted assets on the field, you might compare this new approach to serving as an offensive coordinator in the sky instead. With more sensors, more data, and more assets to manage, but perhaps a bit further removed from our traditional idea of fighter pilots pulling off crazy maneuvers and firing all the missiles themselves. Now, anytime I talk about tactical aircraft turning over some degree of control to network-assisted artificial intelligence or automation, I've come to expect a pretty big deluge of comments about what will happen when these systems inevitably get hacked by adversaries. And to be clear, digital security is a hugely important element of what are coming to be known as kill webs, full of interconnected crewed and uncrewed battlefield assets. But it's also important to understand that these aren't new concerns. The US has been flying remotely operated drones for literally decades now, and in a lot of respects, every fighter to emerge since the F-16 has had its actual flying dictated less and less by direct pilot input and more by onboard computers by the year. That is to say that, of course, there has to be a significant effort placed on securing these systems and the networks that connect them. And of course, there have been and will be situations where cyber attacks manage to penetrate existing defenses. When Iran seemingly hacked an American RQ-170 back in 2011, reportedly by jamming its access to both GPS and land-based control signals, and then using Russian-supplied hardware to transmit spoofed GPS signals to provide it with new landing coordinates, America didn't respond to that by throwing away all of its drones. Instead, it found new ways to harden its drones against these kinds of attacks, so it wouldn't work again if an adversary tried. Embarrassing as that incident was for the United States, it's also just the way of warfare. New technologies emerge, then new counter-technologies emerge in response, and then that original technology changes to meet the new threat posed by those counter-technologies. When body armor became commonplace, we didn't do away with rifles, we started fielding armor-piercing rounds. Likewise, as electronic warfare changes, so too must our approach to networked command and control. The existence of a potential counter isn't a reason to dismiss a technology on its own. More often than not, it's a reason to improve that technology, because no matter the capability, a well-resourced and motivated adversary will eventually find a way to counter it. And in a lot of cases, it's the side that can most quickly adapt to this rapid back and forth technological exchange that comes out on top. So, do I think American drones in the future will be susceptible to cyber attacks and even hacking? Well, as a rule, I would say absolutely. It'll probably happen more than once as the nature of these attacks change. The same way America will manage to hack into adversary drone systems. You can't counter a new attack until you've seen what it is, so some attacks will inevitably succeed, prompting new defensive measures that mitigate those kinds of attacks in the future, and so on and so forth until mankind either finds peace or ultimate destruction. That's not the nature of drones, that's the nature of warfare. But okay, now let's rein in my ranting and get back on topic, because the B-21 has been touted since the onset of this program as an optionally manned bomber platform. And that, combined with the Global Strike Command's recommendation that this aircraft fly with just a single pilot on board, all points toward the Raider being among the first military aircraft to fully embrace this idea of advanced AI co-pilots, which, it's important to note, is distinct from the idea of autopilot as we see in many commercial aircraft today. Modern autopilot systems are integrated into an aircraft's flight management system, or FMS, and its navigation suite, and they're capable of managing most aspects of the run-of-the-mill flight operations between airports. In fact, the more modern autopilot systems can really do everything except taxiing down the runway and takeoff, managing heading and throttle input more or less automatically throughout the ascent, cruise, descent, approach, and even landing phases of flight. But as handy as these systems are, they're also really limited, effectively capable of just doing only what the pilot has programmed them to do. If the circumstances of the flight change, if the course needs to be adjusted, if there's another aircraft to avoid, etc., the pilot is alerted and will need to either take control of the aircraft or at least adjust the program settings of the autopilot to accommodate those changes. To some extent, it might be better to think of autopilot more like cruise control in your car than like a self-flying aircraft. It may be automating throttle response, but if a tree falls in your path, it's going to be up to you to get around it safely. The car isn't capable of recognizing the threat, let alone determining the best course of action around it and then executing it. An advanced AI co-pilot, on the other hand, is a lot more akin to what autopilot sounds like it can do. Rather than relying on pre-programmed directives as provided by the pilot, an AI co-pilot would soak up data from the same wide variety of sensors the human operator uses to make their decisions. If a threat presents itself, like being lit up by a radar array tied to a surface-to-air missile system, well, that AI co-pilot could deploy RF countermeasures and take evasive action, maybe even faster than a human pilot might. If new threats appear on the battlefield that weren't there during mission planning, an AI co-pilot could rapidly calculate the new best possible route through that contested airspace to minimize detection, notifying the pilot as it adjusts its course. This AI co-pilot may be every bit as good as the human operator at most common run-of-the-mill flight operations, and even some of the more complex ones, leaving the actual pilot there to serve primarily as a supervisor, only really needing to take direct control of the aircraft for the most dangerous or complex parts of a mission. In fighters like the F-47, and likely in bombers eventually as well, this can free up the pilot to serve as that offensive coordinator or battle manager, maybe even more so than as the jet's actual pilot. And of course, in extended duration bomber operations, this would mean the pilot could rely on the aircraft's AI co-pilot to handle basic flight functions while they get some rest in between mid-flight refuelings. Just as this optionally manned bomber is meant to eventually fly less complex strike operations without any humans on board at all. And as for the WISO, or Weapons Systems Officer, their responsibilities could vary from managing mission-specific hardware for electronic warfare or radio frequency countermeasures. They could be employing weapon systems that there's at least some evidence to suggest could even include the bomber's own air-to-air missiles. They could be soaking up signals intelligence, identifying targets, conducting immediate battle damage assessments, and of course, managing any drone wingmen the bomber may have flying alongside it. And much like the WISOs found in today's F-15E Strike Eagles, they'd all but certainly receive training in how to fly the aircraft themselves in the event the pilot is incapacitated. And of course, for particularly grueling and stressful long-haul bombing runs, that WISO could just as easily be swapped out for a second pilot to make rest breaks that much more feasible. All told, Global Strike Command's intent of making the B-21's standard crew complement one pilot and one weapons systems officer makes a ton of sense in the broader scope of America's rapid progress toward using artificial intelligence to manage flight duties in drones and fighters. In fact, one could even argue that reducing the number of pilots in strategic bombers points towards America's growing confidence in these AI piloting systems. And if that is indeed the case, then I'd expect to see more aircraft follow the Raiders' lead in the not-too-distant future. Because if these AI agents are capable of flying fighters and bombers, then they'll all but certainly be reducing crew requirements for less arduous missions like cargo operations, just as soon as that control hardware becomes cost-effective enough to install across the whole fleet. And in a lot of ways, this sort of stands in stark contrast to China's more recent developments with the J-20 line, fielding a two-seater J-20 that is all but certainly meant to have a second crew member on board to help manage their own constellations of drone wingmen. And that may suggest China is a little bit less confident in their AI piloting agents than the United States is, at least at this juncture. But that part, to be clear, is just my take. And with that ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and merch from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.